Hi, this is Mike Benoit again. We're going to talk some more about the IRS and the income tax. And we're going to go over what the IRS sends out to people, especially they send it out to people who maybe want to question the IRS about the legitimacy of the income tax. Now, they have a 74-page handout here. Maybe it's bigger than that. Yeah, actually it is. It's 84 pages. And that list goes through all of this supposedly frivolous taxpayer arguments, and it's part of the brainwashing to get you locked into not listening to somebody who might tell you that an income tax is slavery. Now, it's really in depth. Probably take all week to go through this if we did it as a course, and we might just do that. But what I'm going to do is cover the index here. And it starts off, of course, the caption is the truth about frivolous tax arguments. Item 1, Section A, the voluntary nature of the federal income tax. Now, the contention is that the filing of an income tax return is voluntary. Now, the IRS claims that to be a frivolous argument, and they have a lot of data here in this 84-page handout that will explain why it's a frivolous argument. I'm going to tell you a simpler, easier way to understand why it's a frivolous argument, and not in the same manner the IRS is doing, trying to hoodwink you into being locked into the tyranny of the IRS. The filing of a tax return is voluntary. Okay, now if you are actually subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax, of course the filing of a tax return would not be voluntary. The big question is, are you actually subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax? But to argue and say, look, I'm not, I don't have to file a tax return because a tax return is voluntary. Well, all the IRS has to do, or the government has to do in any prosecution, is just turn around and say, okay, well, here's a court case that says it's not voluntary. And of course it's not voluntary if you're actually subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax. So the main point is, are you subject to a tax? If you are, then of course filing a tax return is not voluntary. All right, the next one, payment of the tax is voluntary. Well, you can look up in any law dictionary, anywhere you might want to look, the tax is explained as a mandatory extraction from government. So, of course, filing or payment of a tax is not voluntary. If you are actually subject to and liable for a tax, payment of the tax, of course, cannot be voluntary. All right? Tax is a mandatory extraction of money by government. Okay, so that's never voluntary. But the key point is here, again, we'll keep going back to it, are you subject to or liable for a tax? All right, next on the list is taxpayers can reduce their federal income tax liability by filing a zero return. Okay, if you've studied any of the tapes videos that I've put out, read my book, Tyranny Busters, The Sham and Shame of the Federal Income Tax, or any of Otto Skinner's books, you would certainly not be an advocate of filing a zero income tax return. Filing a zero return is basically saying I don't have any income. Now the reason in the IRS and of course the courts consider that a frivolous argument and a frivolous return. Because what you're saying when you sign an IRS 1040 form is you're saying you're subject to or liable for an income tax, except you don't have any income, so therefore you have zero income, and you're signing their form saying I have zero income, so no tax liability and whatever, give me whatever I paid in back. Well, but and the bottom line is you are saying you're subject to Title 26, the Internal Revenue Code. And so if you say that, if I was the judge, even though I know there is no law that requires you to pay an income tax, if you were saying I don't have to pay an income tax, but I'm going to sign this form that says I'm a taxpayer, because it's an IRS form, and those are for taxpayers, and then you're going to turn around and say I have zero income, I'm going to say, well, that's a frivolous argument. because you just said that you're a taxpayer, and a taxpayer under the code is someone who is subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax. So you can't have your cake and eat it idea. All right. The next one is the IRS must prepare federal tax return for a person who fails to file. Well, that's no more different than if you're not subject to a tax in the Internal Revenue Code, you certainly don't have to file the tax return because you're not subject to a tax. And the IRS wouldn't have to do that either, would they? So, and then how would you actually have a liability unless somebody said, hey, you're liable for a tax and here's the code section that makes you liable. So to say that the IRS must prepare federal tax returns for any person who fails to file is not accurate. Of course, if you're actually liable for a tax, could be you're the distiller of alcoholic beverages. Well, and if they require a return from you, then of course you're still liable for it. You know, if you were the manufacturer of these alcoholic spirits. Okay, and their number 5 is compliance with administrative summons issued by the IRS is voluntary. Right, they're saying that's a frivolous argument. Of course, if you want to check into this, now you could ask the IRS and say, do I have to go to this summons? Right? If they issue a summons, you say, of course, under the Privacy Act or numerous other things, you get an IRS summons, you might want to write them back and say, am I required to go to this? And if I don't go, what's going to happen to me? And then you might, read the code. This is no lazy man's task either. Or look at other cases and you'll see that it's not mandatory on you that you go to one of their summons unless it's backed up by a court order. But the IRS wants to tell you that's a frivolous argument. Well, you can just, instead of making the argument, say you don't have to go, you can always ask them, what happens if you don't go? And the case that you might look up is, I think it's Schulz, not Schultz, but Schulz, Schulz, I think it is. Not sure, don't have it in front of me. But actually covers this subject, and I have some personal experience on that. Now, if it's court ordered that you go to the IRS summons, well, of course, then it becomes mandatory at that point. All right, the meaning of income. This is Section B for these people. Taxable income and gross income. Their first contention, wages, tips, and other compensation received for personal services are not income. Now let's say you're going to make that argument that, wages or tips or other compensation received for personal services are not income. You're trying to prove to a court of law or to anybody else what most everybody believes is to be true. So instead of arguing, well, these wages and tips are not subject to income, they're not income. Instead of making that argument, you would be better off asking the government to prove that they are subject to an income tax, and of course that you're subject to an income tax, and where in the code have you been made subject to or liable for the tax. And of course, if you're a taxpayer, someone who's been made subject to or liable for a tax, then I guess anything could be considered income according to the IRS. But that's the key point. Where have you been made subject to or liable for a tax? And is this a tax on your property, or is this a tax based on some revenue taxable activity that they claim have a right to tax? Indirect tax or direct tax. We have other videos out on this subject. Federal Reserve notes are not income. Well, a lot of people watching this might not know what Federal Reserve notes are. People are thinking that what we're passing around, the currency we're passing around, are dollars. But they are Federal Reserve notes. They're a bank instrument. And to argue that they're not income, basically, again, is arguing that I'm a taxpayer, but I got paid in Federal Reserve notes, and Federal Reserve notes aren't income. Well, you go in front of a judge, and what's the judge going to say? He's going to say to you, well, that's kind of a poppycock. You're going to prove to me that Federal Reserve notes are not income? Of course, you can't prove that. So even though the IRS point in putting this out to you is to kind of, you know, discredit anybody that might challenge the income tax, turns out it is a frivolous argument from people that really know this subject. Military retirement pay does not constitute income. To argue what constitutes income and what doesn't constitute income leaves you in a position that all the government has to do, or the courts have to do, is show you that your argument is frivolous or doesn't hold any water, and the default comes in. The default is you're subject to and liable for a tax. Instead of saying, where in the code have I been made subject to or liable for a tax? Is this a tax on property? Is it a tax on people? Or is it a tax on activities? And don't you think that the taxing statutes ought to be in clear, unequivocal manner so that it's easily understood? Of course it should be. The meaning of certain terms used in the Internal Revenue Code. Contention: taxpayer is not a citizen of the United States, that thus not subject to the federal income tax. There are people that make this argument that I'm not a citizen of the United States, I'm a citizen of California, Texas, Massachusetts, Maine, Alaska, whatever, and I'm not a federal citizen, and so therefore I'm not subject to an income tax. Which is, of course, well, to me it's ridiculous on the surface that you would argue that. But a taxpayer, certainly, you know, when they label you with the term taxpayer, of course, you're someone that's subject or liable to an Internal Revenue Code tax, because the taxpayer is defined in Section 7701 of the Code, and 1313 of the Code is someone who's subject to or liable for an income tax, or liable for an Internal Revenue Code tax, excuse me, any Internal Revenue Code tax. So if you are a taxpayer, then arguing that you're not a citizen of the United States, thus not subject to the federal income tax laws, is just ridiculous and frivolous, and you don't want to use that, even though the IRS is putting this out there to discredit anybody that might say that they're, you know, against this tax tyranny, the slavery tax, the insidious tax known as the income tax. Now, there are some folks who will say, oh, if you don't have an income tax, how are you going to pay for the legitimate services of government? Well, first, the legitimate services of government are very narrowly defined by the Constitution, and about 20%, maybe 10% of what government at the federal level is doing is actually constitutional. So that's another issue altogether. There, number 3, under the meaning of certain terms used in the Internal Revenue Code, taxpayer is not a person as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, thus is not subject to the federal income tax. And again, to make this argument, first, the IRS always uses the term taxpayer, which, if they call you a taxpayer, right, then they're saying you're subject to or liable for an Internal Revenue Code. I refuse that appellation, and I would like to know what it is that I'm doing that makes me subject to the Internal Revenue Code. I'm smart enough to know, I've studied taxes, and I know about direct and indirect taxes. I'm smart enough to know that the federal government doesn't have any direct taxes at the moment, and I don't know exactly when they did last have a direct tax. I know that some of the Supreme Court decisions ruled taxes as being direct, and they weren't apportioned, so the Supreme Court ruled them as being unconstitutional. But anyway, as it goes today, the only tax that the federal government is putting out there that I can find in the Internal Revenue Code are indirect taxes, and they're done on activities. So I'd like to know what activity I'm engaged in that is subject to the being taxed by the Internal Revenue Code. So never argue that you're not a person as defined in the code, and therefore you're not subject to the federal income tax. All I have to do is show that that's a ridiculous argument. You are a person as defined in the code, and so we're left with a default that you're subject to it without the government having to prove where in the code you were made subject to it. Okay, next, the only employees subject to the federal income tax are employees of the federal government. There's a very popular argument out there, and that somehow the terminology in the code refers to federal government employees, and so they're subject to this tax and nobody else is. Well, then again, it's the same kind of thing. You make that statement, the courts and the government can just come out and say, this is not true, this is why it's not true, it's a frivolous argument. The default is, then you are subject to it. Instead of, where have I been made subject to or liable for this so-called tax in the Internal Revenue Code? What activity am I engaged in that makes me subject to this? Put the burden of proof on them.